do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill. Now this was a trick question. For the Pharisees, certainly couldn't answer that it was lawful to do evil on the Sabbath. It's never lawful to do evil. But neither could they say that it was lawful to do good on the Sabbath, because then Jesus would be free to heal the man, which is a violation of their strict laws. With the question, Jesus had the Pharisees trapped. And realizing this, the Pharisees just crossed their arms and said nothing. Jesus looked around the room, and his heart was deeply troubled. The supposed religious elite had no idea how to truly handle the Sabbath. They had turned the Sabbath into a day of oppression. They cared more about their laws than they cared about people. They were missing the point. They did not understand what keeping the Sabbath day holy truly meant. Now, the modern church is also a little confused about how we handle the fourth commandment. Of all the 10 commandments, it's probably the one we're most willing to break. I mean, we would never willingly worship another God, at least not intentionally. We would certainly never say it's okay to murder or steal or commit adultery. But with the fourth commandment, we kind of look at it like, yeah, it's more of a polite suggestion. And this is kind of strange because at one point in Reformed history, the Sabbath day was probably the most scrutinized day of the week. It was, the fourth commandment was probably the one that people got most up in arms about. And it seems as if in the last few decades, Christians have gone from being very strict about the Sabbath to kind of a laissez-faire, whatever you want goes on the Sabbath. In my opening example, how many people were really upset with the notion of golfing on Sunday? My parents, including my Pastor Greg's mom, who's also here today, they used to have maybe rules that seem a little strange to us nowadays. My mom says that when she would go to the lake on Sunday, she wasn't allowed to go in the water above her knees, because going in above your knees meant you were swimming, and swimming wasn't allowed. My grandma's laughing and shaking her head at me right now. Other stories included not being able to watch TV or ride a bike. My dad says that growing up, he was allowed to play tackle football with his brothers in the basement of their house, but he couldn't do it in the backyard because that was somehow not observing the Sabbath. I had a Sunday school teacher who once said that on Saturday night, he wasn't even allowed to go on dates because you had to spend Saturday night preparing for Sunday. I'm sure everyone here in this audience has heard similar stories. It seemed as if Christians have gone from these rather arbitrary rules to suddenly not really caring what happens on Sunday. Suddenly, Sunday has become just another day to get things done. Another day for productivity and pleasure. Make a little money, get a little homework done, hang out with friends, just another day. Have we as a society lost our respect for the Sabbath? While many of the rules in the past seem a little arbitrary, and perhaps even a little silly nowadays, they did convey that Sunday is special. And keeping the Sabbath holy is still a biblical command. The 10 Commandments aren't polite suggestions. They're rules to live by. So, how do we respect the Sabbath? But even as we admit to valuing the Sabbath a little bit, it doesn't make much sense to go back to the old way. Very few people here define swimming as defiling the Sabbath. Watching TV is almost the exact opposite of work. Do we really want to become like the Pharisees again and argue over minute points of law? Would God really be glorified if we didn't put out fires on Sunday that were destroying houses? Can a nurse not give pain meds on Sunday because pain is not life-threatening. Is God literally served if we don't do anything? Is God served by what we do or what we don't do? In short, we're kind of in between two extremes, and neither seems real satisfying. As all Christians, we need to turn to the words of Jesus. In the first part of today's scripture, the Pharisees caught Jesus' disciples red-handed. The Pharisees were right in saying that the disciples were sinning by picking grain. Legally, they were working on the Sabbath, and working was against the rules. However, Jesus was ready for such a charge. Already in the book of Mark, Jesus had repeatedly had conflict, friction with the Pharisees over the interpretation of the law. Everything Jesus had done so far in his life seemed to irritate the Pharisees. In response to the Pharisees' allegations, Jesus reminds them of the story of David, which can be found in 1 Samuel chapter 21. In this story, David and his men were on the run from King Saul. King Saul was trying to kill David, and so David and his men were fleeing from town to town, from cave to cave, hiding. Now, when you're on the run, you don't necessarily always have a lot of supplies. So one day, David and his men were particularly hungry, and they needed food. So David went to the local temple. Now, when David entered the temple, he asked the priest for some bread. The priest said, "Well, I'm sorry, we don't have any bread on hand. The only bread we have right now are 12 loaves of bread that are placed each week before the altar of God. And only the priests were allowed to eat these 12 loaves of bread." However, David pleaded with the priest, and the priest eventually gave David the 12 loaves of bread so that his men would not starve. Now, according to the law, the ceremonial law of the time, David had committed sin. However, Jesus, a couple hundred years later, made it clear that David was acting in a permissible fashion. Ceremonial laws were not as important as human life. Jesus' disciples were hungry, and they were permitted to satisfy their physical needs, even though it was a Sabbath. While the laws were still important, they were not more important than human life. Then Jesus goes a step further, a big step further. Jesus finishes the story by saying, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Sabbath observance is a big deal in biblical times, literally a matter of life and death. However, Jesus decided to reframe the issue. Observing the Sabbath was not the point of the Sabbath. The Sabbath, in and of itself, was not particularly holy. God had made the Sabbath sacred. The created Sabbath did not tell the Creator how to behave. God had made the Sabbath day holy in order to be a benefit to mankind, not a curse. The Sabbath was intended to be a day of joy, a day where everyone, from king to slave, could take time to focus solely on worshiping God. A day where earthly concerns could be put aside. It was meant to be a day where believers were free to delight in the Lord their God. The Sabbath was given as a gift to man, not a curse. That is illustrated again in Mark 3. In the eyes of some, healing was considered work on the Sabbath. It didn't matter the outcome, it was work. However, God had designed the Sabbath for a greater purpose. That is why Jesus had this disabled man stand up in the presence of everyone. Jesus, after making sure everyone was watching, healed the man. Now, why would Jesus so willfully disobey?